The neon spill of Times Square bled into the low-hung clouds, turning the night air a restless violet as Thayer Carlyle leaned against the tinted window of the stretch Maybach, willing himself to feel triumphant. Hours earlier he had closed the most aggressive acquisition in Aurora logistics history, yet the familiar rush that usually followed victory abandoned him tonight like a fickle lover. When the sedan eased to a stop beside the discreet side entrance of the Halcyon Hotel, he dismissed both driver and security with a flicker of impatience. He wanted anonymity, the crackle of the city unfiltered, something raw enough to slice through his inertia. Up on the 63rd floor rooftop bar, the skyline yawned wide and glittering, and the April wind came sharp off the Hudson. Thayer ordered a single malt neat and claimed a corner banquette draped in midnight velvet. From here he could study the patrons without being studied himself, venture capital sharks prowling for the next pitch deck, models orbiting anyone who wore a Patek Philippe, tourists trying on borrowed swagger for size. He wondered, with a stab of self-mockery, which category he now belonged to, because satisfaction, real, bone-deep satisfaction, had eluded him for so long he almost doubted it existed. Then the elevator doors opened, and a woman stepped out who did not match the curated decadence around her. She was tall but carried herself as though apologizing for the space her limbs occupied, slipping sideways between tables to avoid brushing shoulders. Her hair was a chaotic tumble of sun-paled blonde, knotted at the nape with a pencil. A visitor's badge from the American Zoological Society conference swung forgotten from the strap of an aged canvas satchel. She ordered chamomile tea from a bemused bartender, an act so defiantly unglamorous Thayer's lips twitched before he realized he was smiling. He watched her cross to the glass parapet, lift her mug in both hands like a campfire cup, and exhale fog onto the city lights. In that small motion he caught a texture of homesickness, no, of longing, that mirrored his own. On impulse, and because he had built an empire on reading invisible signals, Thayer slid from the banquette and approached. "Careful," he said, nodding at the gust threatening to whip the steam from her drink. "Manhattan wind has more attitude than the people." She turned, startled, and he braced for the usual flicker of recognition, the double take, the rapid calculation of net worth. Instead, her eyes, startlingly green under amber deck lights, searched his face without landing on the answer. "Good to know," she replied. "I'm new to its mood swings." Her voice held the calm cadence of someone used to coaxing skittish creatures from hiding, low enough that he had to lean closer. A citrus and cedar scent, unbranded and honest, threaded the chill air between them. "I'm Thayer," he offered. "Saraphina," she said, pushing an escaped curl behind her ear. "Saraphina Waverly." He felt the syllables lodge somewhere beneath his sternum. What brings Saraphina Waverly to a rooftop bar renowned for overpriced cocktails and questionable DJ sets? "Jet lag," she said, a wry tilt to her mouth. The conference hotel coffee tasted like melted cardboard, and the desk clerk swore this place had the best view in Midtown. "I needed to clear my head before presenting tomorrow on chemosensory communication in Melanoplus differentialis." He blinked. "Grasshoppers?" "Plain-winged kumquats, actually," she corrected, and then laughed at his expression. "Sorry, occupational hazard." The laugh ricocheted inside him, unpremeditated, free of the strategic brightness he normally encountered. He felt an absurd lift, as if the skyline shifted closer. They talked, at first haltingly, then with gathering ease. She described spending weeks in South Dakota prairies charting mating chirps under starlight. He admitted he hadn't seen a real night sky in years, that every schedule he kept was backlit by blue screens. She teased him about it, calling him light-polluted, and he pretended offense. Outside the glass, thunderheads gathered over New Jersey, fracturing distant flashes that strobed their reflections. Hours bled uncounted. They migrated to an empty parquet square where earlier a wedding party had abandoned ribbons and confetti. A saxophonist packing up indulged Seraphina's shy request for something with twilight in it, and slipped into a husky rendition of Moonglow. Thayer had never slow danced without paparazzi calculating the retail price of his cufflinks, but here, no lenses hunted them. Her palms were cool, steadying his pulse, when she laughed mid-step at her own clumsiness, he laughed with her, and the sound felt unfamiliar in his throat, like a language he'd forgotten. Just before 4, wind chased the last guests downstairs. Lightning licked the Chrysler Building's antenna, and rain stitched erratic silver lines through the floodlights. Saraphina lifted her face to the downpour and spun once, hair unfurling. Thayer knew the rational choice: take a car, end the night politely. Instead, he offered his hand. No promises, no plans. Only the raw honesty of two strangers awake in the same improbable second of the city's sleepless heart. When they reached the private elevator, water dripped from their clothes, pooling at their feet. Thayer swiped a keycard for the penthouse suite he rarely used except for meetings he wanted absolutely confidential. The mirrored doors reflected him, rain-soaked billionaire, and her, drenched field scientist, standing shoulder to shoulder, laughing like fugitives from their own separate narratives. The descent into silence felt charged, yet not awkward. In her nearness he sensed no agenda, no calculation. She traced a finger over the embossed company logo on his cufflink, pronouncing Aurora softly, as though testing the weight of the word. He should have explained then who he was, what this elevator implied. But the confession tangled behind his teeth, crowded out by a thrill of uncertainty he hadn't tasted since his first startup pitch at 21. The suite doors opened with a sigh of climate-controlled air, and Manhattan's storm fell away behind triple-paned glass. Inside, everything smelled of petrichor and possibility. Thayer wondered, with a sharp, chest-tight squeeze of anticipation, if this moment, this impossible collision, was the start of something he couldn't spreadsheet or forecast. And even though dawn's pale edge already pressed against the storm clouds, neither of them spoke a word of goodbye. Saraphina stood just inside the threshold, taking in the quiet opulence with the alert curiosity of someone walking an unfamiliar forest at dusk. The suite stretched 2 stories, its mezzanine ringed by steel and glass balustrades and lit in warm pockets that made the rainy skyline appear distant and mythic. One half of her mind registered the details: an Alexander Calder lithograph above a floating staircase, the scent of cedar and eucalyptus from a discreet diffuser, a lone sneaker abandoned beside a marble console as though its owner had been in too much of a hurry to complete the pair. The other half of her mind whispered run, because intimacy was territory she had mapped only in theory. Thayer motioned toward the open kitchen. "I can make coffee," he offered, voice husky from the chill. "Or something stronger." He raked a hand through rain-dark hair, droplets flicking onto the matte countertop. His tailored shirt clung transparently to the lines of his shoulders. For the first time she noticed how vulnerable a powerful man could look when stripped of ceremony. "Tea, if you have it," she said, clutching the satchel that now seemed absurd among the quartz and chrome. He rummaged through cabinets, expensive ones that opened with a silent hydraulic sigh, and produced an imported oolong, apologizing that he had no honey, only agave. The domestic ordinariness of the act softened her nerves. While water heated, he offered a cashmere hoodie, leaving briefly to change into a t-shirt and drawstring pants. The borrowed hoodie reached her thighs. It smelled of his cologne, cardamom threaded with something metallic, like rain on iron. They settled on a sectional facing 3 stories of window. The storm outside hurled itself at the glass, each strike a muffled drumbeat. Saraphina cupped the steaming mug and watched reflections ripple across the dark floors. "Tell me about your grasshoppers," he said, tucking one knee beneath himself. No potential funder had ever asked with that kind of earnest interest. She explained how male kumquats generated frequency-modulated chirps to locate females in prairie grass too dense for visual cues. Her hand sketched Doppler arcs in the air, and Thayer's eyes tracked every motion as if each gesture unlocked a code. When she paused, embarrassed by her own enthusiasm, he urged her on. Eventually conversation fled into bigger territories: her mother's thrift store violin that taught her patience, his childhood evenings spent decoding patent filings while his friends played baseball, the way both of them feared stillness for different reasons. Hours slipped. At length Thayer rose and dimmed the lights. "You look exhausted," he murmured. "Stay. The guest room is through there." His thumb brushed the ridge of her knuckles in passing, an accidental spark or an intentional test, she could not tell. Either way, something inside her lungs compressed until breath came jagged. "I'm not sure," she set the mug down, heart thudding. The guest room was safety, the master suite, whose half-open door revealed a canopy bed draped in charcoal linen, was gravity. He stopped a polite distance away. "Saraphina, I don't want you to do anything you'll regret at dawn. If that means calling you a car right now, just say so." The sincerity disarmed her more than overt desire could have. She rose, closing the space between them one deliberate step at a time. Moisture from her hair traced cold lines down her collarbone. "I won't regret choosing," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. Then she slipped her fingers through his, felt him inhale, felt the shift of decision land between them like the strike of a match. He guided her toward the master suite with almost ceremonial slowness, pausing to kiss the inside of her wrist as though asking permission 1 inch at a time. In the doorway she hesitated. Years of focused academia, of field stations and bunkhouses, had left little space for the messy, unquantifiable art of intimacy. She had carried that inexperience like an old-fashioned secret, unsure whether it was badge or burden. Thayer seemed to sense the tremor. "Tell me what you need," he whispered. "Patience," she managed. "I'm new to this." His expression shifted through surprise, tenderness, and a protective ferocity that pierced her defenses. "Then patience is what you'll have." What followed unfolded less like surrender and more like slow, precise research, two curious minds cataloging each other's reactions with reverence. He traced the constellation of freckles on her shoulder, naming them after cities his cargo ships favored. She mapped the faint scar below his ribs, a remnant of a teenage motorcycle crash he'd never confessed to the financial press. When at last he understood her unspoken admission, that no one had ever crossed this threshold with her, he stilled, eyes shining in the moody lamplight. "If at any moment this stops feeling right, we stop," he vowed, voice unsteady. She answered by sliding trembling palms along his jaw, guiding his mouth back to hers. The rest she recorded not in sentences but in sensory fragments, the warmth of skin after cold rain, the low groan he failed to smother when she whispered his name, the unexpected comedy of tangled drawstrings and mismatched socks that made them both laugh into each other's throats. When pain flared, it ebbed quickly, replaced by a pulse of wonder that widened her entire sense of self. Dawn dimmed the city's neon until only pearl-gray horizons remained. Wrapped in sheets that smelled faintly of ozone and him, Saraphina lay on her side watching Thayer sleep, lashes fanned, brow uncreased. She'd half expected a titan of commerce to look armored even in rest. Instead, he seemed boyish, almost fragile, fingers still curled as though searching for her hand. She slipped from the bed, padding silently to the floor-to-ceiling window. Storm clouds had cleared, leaving the East River blushing under first light. Below, taxis already hunked awake. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and exhaled, a swirl of condensation blooming outward like a fern. Behind her the mattress rustled. "You okay?" Thayer's voice was thick with sleep but laced with immediate concern. She turned, hoodie draped like a borrowed dawn over her shoulders. "More than okay," she said, cheeks heating. "I just needed to see if the planet still existed." He propped himself on an elbow, dark hair chaotic as wind-tossed grass. "It does," he answered. "But it looks different this morning." She laughed softly, the sound buoyant, and crossed back to the bed. He caught her hand, pressed a lingering kiss to the inside of her wrist, the same spot where the night had tipped from polite curiosity into electricity. "I have a board meeting at 9, he admitted, regret coloring the confession. "I can have the car take you anywhere you want. Or you can stay, sleep in, raid the kitchenette. The place is yours." "Conference rehearsal," she sighed, rolling her eyes. "But thank you." She searched his face, hunting for the faintest flicker of post-conquest detachment. Instead she found an almost startled joy, as though he'd uncovered a rare isotope in her presence and was awed by its glow. "Text me," he asked, tentative. If that's not too presumptuous. She pretended to weigh the request, then leaned down to kiss him, stealing his answer with a smile. When she finally left, after a shower in a bathroom tiled like a moonlit grotto, after borrowing a hotel pen to scrawl her number on his forearm because her phone was dead, the elevator doors closed on a view of him standing barefoot in corridor light, watching her as though she were the first sunrise he'd ever bothered to witness. And though the city would soon swallow them into separate agendas, each carried an identical sensation on their skin, the dawning intuition that some nights change not only the route of a life, but its entire gravitational logic. Thayer's penthouse still smelled faintly of petrichor and oolong when he stepped into the private elevator 2 hours after Saraphina left. His forearm, scrubbed carefully so the board wouldn't notice the ink, still bore the indigo ghost of her phone number, a set of crooked digits that felt more valuable than the market cap he'd fought to defend for a decade. As the lift sank toward the lobby, he replayed the night in sensory loops, the trembling precision with which she'd said patience, the surprised laugh that followed their clumsy tangle of drawstrings, the way morning light had threaded through her hair like pale copper wire. Each memory arrived with the bright sting of fresh citrus, the sum of them left him alert, almost giddy, in a way he hadn't felt since raising his first seed round at 21. But giddiness had no place in Aurora Logistics' marble atrium. By the time he crossed it, security and executive assistants were already choreographing a corridor of efficiency, files to initial, questions to approve, a visitor from the European Trade Commission waiting in Conference 3. Thayer slipped a blazer over his black t-shirt, shoved his damp hair into orderly submission, and tried to locate the armor he normally wore to shareholder meetings. It slid into place only halfway, some plates refused to lock. On the 42nd floor, the quarterly strategy session was in full swing. A dozen directors flanked the polished walnut table, their tablets aglow with projections of container fleet expansion and carbon offsets. CFO Marietta Quinlan launched into a presentation about the newly acquired Baltic shipping lanes. Thayer usually savored these numbers, profit margins were a language he'd spoken more fluently than English since puberty, but today the columns blurred. His mind detoured to the smaller, messier math of one Saraphina Waverly, how long until her keynote? Would her palms shake, or would she command the room with the same unself-conscious certainty she'd shown describing Grasshopper Song? When Marietta paused for questions, Thayer realized the room expected commentary from the chair at the head of the table, his chair. He cleared his throat, summoned 2 decades of muscle memory, and delivered a concise assessment of fluctuating fuel hedges. The words emerged crisp, but inside he marveled that his mouth could still shape them while his heart hammered an entirely different agenda. At 9:47 a.m. his phone buzzed in his pocket. Even as he ignored it, a ripple of anticipation warmed the space behind his ribs. 5 minutes later it buzzed again. By the third buzz he excused himself under the pretense of an urgent call from the Singapore office and stepped into a soundproof glass alcove. He swiped the screen. "You okay?" The first text read. The time stamp was 9:46. Under it, another. "Just realized you probably skipped breakfast. Industrial coffee at convention center is lethal, eat something real." He stared, struck dumb by the mundane tenderness of the message. How many times had someone reminded him to eat? He could count them on one hand, and most of those had been in childhood. His thumbs hovered over the screen, clumsy with disproportionate weight, he erased 3 drafts before settling on. Boardroom pastries barely qualify as food. Suggestions? Her reply arrived before he could return to the meeting. Corner of 49th and 8th, there's a Guatemalan bodega with tamales that melt stress. Get the green chili kind. He grinned, sudden and unfiltered, so wide the security guard across the hall looked startled. He typed. Trade you, tamales for a victory dinner tonight after your presentation. Your choice of cuisine, field scientist. 3 dots blinked, disappeared, blinked again. The length of the pause cut through his buoyancy, maybe he'd misread the spontaneity of dawn's afterglow. Finally. Tempting, but I'm flying to Queen's Zoo this evening for nocturnal insect census. Rain date backup? He laughed softly, of course she was. He told her tomorrow worked, sent a ridiculous gif of a grasshopper playing a violin, then forced his professional mask back on and re-entered the boardroom. Yet something fundamental had shifted. He no longer felt trapped under fluorescent scrutiny, instead he was a secret agent smuggling sunrise into corporate daylight. After the meeting, he retreated to his corner office, a cantilevered glass perch above the East River. He thumbed through Saraphina's public academic profile, bare bones, no social media links, then toggled to Aurora's HR system and keyed in a request, draft a proposal for a cross-disciplinary conservation grant. It was a flimsy pretext to keep her in the orbit of his company's resources, but he justified it as enlightened corporate citizenship. Besides, the PR optics of supporting endangered prairie ecosystems were impeccable. His personal assistant, Keiko, knocked gently. The halcyon sent your dry cleaning. Also, the communications team wants to finalize talking points about the Marseille port labor dispute. Thanks, he said, distracted. Then, before she could leave, can you call Acting Director Ramos at Queen's Zoo? Tell him I'd like to donate temporary lighting rigs for tonight's insect survey, full-spectrum LEDs, minimal heat. Make sure they use battery packs, no noisy generators. Keiko's eyebrows lifted, but she only nodded. Of course, sir. The afternoon crawled. Thayer skimmed contracts, annotated a supply chain timeline, greenlit a pilot program for hydrogen-fueled tugs. Yet every hour he glanced at his phone, hungry for another message. By 3 o'clock he could visualize Saraphina at the Midtown Convention Center, hair pinned into a neater version of its Nightwind chaos, laser pointer steady as she guided graphs across a screen no one outside her microdiscipline would understand. The thought filled him with an absurd, swelling pride. At 3:26 p.m. a photo flashed onto his display, a blurry self-portrait of Saraphina in a dim lecture hall. She wore round safety goggles and a fluorescent orange vest labeled Live Specimen Handling. The caption read, "They're making me outfit like a crossing guard. If I vanish, avenge me." Thayer nearly laughed loud enough for the glass walls to vibrate. He replied with a snapshot of his boardroom's whiteboard, where he'd scribbled revenue arrows around a stick-figure grasshopper wearing a crown. Your kingdom awaits. He watched 3 dots blink again but no follow-up came. She was probably back on stage fielding questions from skeptics who didn't grasp why prairie orthopterans mattered to climate change modeling. By early evening clouds returned, shelving slate shadows over the river. Thayer ordered the Maybach to swing by the Guatemalan bodega and loaded a bag with tamales, plantain chips, and 2 glass bottles of horchata. He instructed the driver to reroute to Queens. During the ride he reread Saraphina's last text so many times the screen timed out from inactivity. The zoo after hours smelled of damp bark and distant hay. He found the insect team assembling equipment near the butterfly pavilion. Reflective cones ringed floodlights, beyond them, bats flitted under a sky turning cobalt. Saraphina emerged from behind a portable white screen, clipboard in hand, vest too large but somehow perfect. When she spotted him, her eyes widened, not alarm, but a deer-caught-in sunbeam wonder that made his pulse slam. I come bearing contraband, he said, lifting the paper bag. Tamales, she guessed. And horchata. He offered the bottle like a peace treaty. You'll need sugar to power through counting beetle antennae. Her smile came slowly, then ignited. Have you ever done an insect census? I've acquired companies in 6 time zones since dawn, he said, but I have never counted bugs. I'm prepared to be humbled. After a brief negotiation with the project coordinator, who seemed too overworked to object to volunteer labor, Thayer found himself standing under an ultraviolet sheet, notebook in one hand, flashlight in the other. Moths thudded against the fabric, silhouettes primal as ink blots. Saraphina dictated species IDs, her voice dipping into Latin pronunciations with the same gentle authority she'd used to coax meaning from grasshopper chirps. He tallied numbers, determined not to fumble. Between assignments they crouched on a bench beside a silent owl exhibit and devoured tamales still steaming in their husks. Midnight crept in. The last data point logged, crew members packed crates and coils of extension cable. Saraphina peeled off her vest, shaking loose strands of hair that glowed silver in moonlight filtered through mesh aviaries. She looked tired, there were smudges of dirt on her cheek, and her fingernails held crescents of soil, but Thayer had never seen anyone inhabit fatigue so radiantly. "Thank you," she said, voice pitched low to avoid disturbing nocturnal lemurs nearby. "No one volunteers for the dull parts." "Incorrect," he answered. "I volunteer for all dull parts if they come with company. Be careful." She slung her satchel over one shoulder. "That sounds dangerously like sincerity." "Sincerity," he echoed, and realized he hadn't felt the texture of the word in years. It fit, unexpectedly. She glanced at her watch, nearly 1 a.m., I should taxi to Astoria. Early flight to Sioux Falls tomorrow. The words jolted him. South Dakota. Already? Field survey resumes, she explained. Only 3 days. I'll be back Wednesday. He exhaled relief at the timeline. I'll pick you up. Thayer, that's non-negotiable, he interrupted softly. She chewed her lip, then nodded. Just so you know, prairie lodging is bare bones. You'd hate it. Try me. A zoo golf cart whisked them toward the staff exit. The driver, half asleep, didn't bother eavesdropping. At the gate Thayer cupped Saraphina's elbows. Safe flight, he said, and leaned in before his courage could ebb. He kissed her forehead, an instinctive, utterly un-CEO gesture, then stepped back. She touched the spot he'd kissed as if checking it had really happened. Eat something that isn't Boardroom pastry, she whispered. Then she walked away into the sodium glow of the parking lot, and every cell in his body urged him to follow. Instead he watched until the taxi merged with traffic, hand closing over the place where her phone number had once stained his skin. He felt the same startled joy as sunrise in his penthouse doorway, but now it was tempered by ache. 3 days without that laugh, those green eyes, that impossible juxtaposition of scientific rigor and unguarded wonder. Yet the ache did not diminish him, it clarified. It told him what all his data models never had, that scarcity wasn't what drove value, connection was. Back in the Maybach, he opened a blank note on his phone and titled it simply, Ways to Keep Her World Intact. Beneath it he began a bulleted list, grant proposals, carbon offset shipping corridors near protected prairies, scholarships in her department's name, then paused. He deleted every bullet. Those were gestures a billionaire performed to feel generous. What Saraphina valued wasn't leverage, it was authenticity. So he wrote instead. Listen without trying to fix. Ask questions and wait for real answers. Show up, quietly, consistently, without fanfare. He saved the note, closed his eyes, and let the car carry him through a city winding down to its few honest heartbeats. Somewhere above the skyline, the first cargo flight of the day banked toward Europe, loaded with parcels stamped by his empire. He pictured circuits of logistics racing around the globe, while in the center of that whirl, one woman with prairie soil under her nails slept, unaware that the axis of another life had tilted firmly toward her. Thayer managed to keep his hands off his phone for exactly 6 minutes after Saraphina's taxi disappeared, then caved and scrolled through the photo she had sent from the lecture hall for the 1,000th time. A rational voice in his head, honed by years of risk assessment, warned that a 48-hour acquaintance was too thin a foundation for this level of preoccupation. He ignored it. Some data sets rewrote the model, Saraphina was one of them. During the 3 days she spent in South Dakota prairie country, he filled the empty hours with schemes that felt half strategic, half devotional. At dawn on Monday he phoned Aurora's sustainability division and redirected capital from a dormant urban rooftop farm project to a new field grant, anthropogenic noise impact on orthopteran courtship, principal investigator, S. Waverly. By lunch he had cajoled their general counsel into drafting a memorandum of understanding that pledged full academic independence, no corporate veto, no publicity photos unless she asked. The council, accustomed to Thayer's perfectionist edits, raised an eyebrow at the speed, but signed. Tuesday night, insomnia drove him to the R&D lab where engineers were stress-testing reusable container seals. He commandeered a whiteboard and diagrammed a silent supply chain, a transport corridor that would hit emission reduction targets 5 years ahead of schedule. Watching diesel-smeared trajectories transform into thin green vectors, he experienced an unfamiliar pride. These weren't numbers to delight investors but an offering to one woman's worldview. Between meetings he and Saraphina texted in a rhythm that felt both effortless and improbable. She sent photos of sunrise halos over needle grass, of a prairie dog perched like a sentry beside her tent. He replied with candids of Aurora's rooftop apiary where bees hummed around purple salvia. Once, out of nowhere, she wrote, "Do you ever feel you're piloting your life from a remote cockpit, one step removed from the velocity?" He typed, deleted, retyped, and finally sent, "Yes. But lately I'm learning to crack the window, feel the wind myself." Her answer was a smile emoji wearing aviator goggles. Stupid as it was, he kept opening the chat just to see it. Wednesday afternoon Thayer stood in the arrivals hall at LaGuardia, black baseball cap pulled low despite the fact no paparazzi prowled the midweek regional gates. When Seraphina emerged, hair braided down her shoulder, wearing a canvas jacket dusted with prairie soil, his chest tightened with something disturbingly close to relief. She waved the handle of her rolling duffel like a semaphore flag and quickened her pace, but right before impact she hesitated, uncertain how much public space they had permission to occupy. Thayer bridged the gap with 2 strides and settled for cupping her elbows, tugging her gently into the ease of his orbit. Her answering smile dissolved the ambient clatter of luggage wheels and overhead announcements. He ushered her toward the curb where a nondescript electric sedan idled in place of the Maybach. "Thought we'd go incognito," he explained. "Less intimidating." "In what?" she teased as she slid inside. "Your idea of low profile probably costs more than a semester of my grant stipend." "Harsh," he laughed, pulling the door shut behind him. "Give me a chance, I'm experimenting with humility." Traffic into Manhattan was mercifully light. She filled the ride with stories of field mishaps, an entire data logger swallowed by a curious cow, a grad student who mistook coyote calls for punk rock feedback until the animal trotted past his tent flap. Thayer listened, committing each anecdote to memory the way he once memorized freight tariffs. When she paused to sip water, he cleared his throat. "I have an ulterior motive today," he said. "Nothing sinister, I promise. I'd like to show you something at Aurora HQ, 15 minutes, tops." Her gaze flicked sideways, cautious but not closed. "Is this about the grant contract your assistant emailed?" "Partly." He made himself keep both hands on the steering wheel rather than reach for hers. "But mostly it's about transparency. You should know how the sausage is made before you decide whether you want any part of it." She tipped back her head against the seat, eyes on the skyline sliding past the windshield. "Fair. A beat later, if at any point it feels like a PR ambush I'm walking out, even if it means base jumping off your fancy terrace." Duly noted. Though the terrace has safety glass 5 centimeters thick. Challenge accepted, she deadpanned, and the last of his tension unwound. 30 minutes later she stood beside him in Aurora's lobby, dwarfed by pillars of recycled steel polished to a mirror sheen. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and algorithmic success. Saraphina rotated slowly, taking in the kinetic sculpture of interlocking gears suspended from the atrium ceiling. "It's like standing inside a Swiss watch," she murmured. "Most visitors say clockwork," he replied. "I like that you upgraded us." They rode a private elevator directly to the 30th floor, no badge scans, no pauses. When the doors parted, instead of gleaming desks and wall-sized displays she found herself in a greenhouse-bright lab where planters of switchgrass grew under full-spectrum LEDs. 2 ecologists in denim aprons sampled soil cores while a programmer in a purple hoodie monitored sensor readouts. "This is the prototype carbon sink project," Thayer said, handing her a visitor's tablet that streamed root mass indices in real time. "We test prairie species against shipping yard contaminants. If the grass thrives here, it can rehabilitate any spoil site in our network. We're 6 months from scaling. Saraphina crouched to examine a clump of Sporobolus heterolepis bursting with pinkish seed heads. You're bioremediating in situ? She sounded equal parts skeptical and impressed. You know, half the academic community thinks corporate ecolabs are greenwashed tax shelters. Which is why the data sets will remain open source, he countered. Peer review in real time. Headaches for our lawyers, but I'm done hiding behind NDAs. She tucked a stray hair behind her ear, grinning despite herself. That's either visionary or reckless. Both, he admitted. I've learned they're cousins. He guided her through the living lab into an observation gallery overlooking Aurora's operations floor, a hive of screens tracking cargo vessels inching across glowing pixel seas. From above the activity looked tranquil, choreographed, a digital orrery. Saraphina pressed her palm to the glass, mesmerized by neon shipping lanes pulsing with color-coded fuel efficiencies. How many people depend on these lines, she asked. Directly, about 43,000 employees. Indirectly, millions. He waited while she absorbed the scope. It terrifies me, some days, he confessed quietly. The ratio of decisions to consequences. She turned, studying him with field biologist acuity, as though he were a migratory species revealing its secret route. Maybe that's healthy. Fear keeps power honest. The word struck like a tuning fork. He wanted to close the distance, kiss her right here under the algorithmic sky, but instead he reached for the satchel strap on her shoulder, slid it gently down, and retrieved a rolled-up notebook from the side pocket. I did a little homework, he said, unrolling the pages onto a console. There, sketched in his angular handwriting, was a proposed expedition itinerary: Aurora freighters rerouted via Houston to transport research gear to Ecuador, a supply drop for an indigenous bat conservation NGO she had mentioned in passing, time buffers aligning with her teaching semester. These are only suggestions, he added quickly. You can shred them if I've overstepped. Saraphina traced a line representing container vessel ALX, Mercury sailing from Galveston through the canal. You scheduled docking windows around peak mating season for the big-eared leaf-nosed bat. I pay attention. His voice came out rougher than intended. She rolled the charts back up, slid the notebook under her arm, then surprised him by stepping forward and resting her forehead briefly against his clavicle, a small, intimate thank you that made his pulse riot. You really do. Down in the lobby, Marietta Quinlan strode across the marble floor with 2 board members in tow. Catching sight of them through the vantage glass, Thayer felt the old reflex to disentangle himself, but resisted. Instead he lifted Saraphina's hand, threading their fingers together where the entire corporate engine could witness. The gesture was neither show nor secret, it was declaration. Saraphina's grip tightened. I don't want to be your headline, Thayer, she whispered, almost pleading. You won't be. He turned her hand over, brushed a thumb along her calloused fingertips, evidence of field notes written against tentpole ridges and rough bark. I want you to be the reason the headline changes. In the limousine that carried them uptown afterward, her satchel now sharing the seat with a single planter of switchgrass she insisted on adopting for her apartment balcony, they rode mostly in silence. City lights chased across the window, flickering gold on her profile. At Columbus Circle the car paused at a red light, and she spoke without looking at him. I'm not a grand gesture person, she said. Last night at the Prairie Station, I slept on a cot wedged between microscopes and a box of granola bars. That chaos makes sense to me. Your world still feels holographic. I can't promise it'll ever look simple, he answered, but I can promise it will make room. She nodded slowly, then leaned sideways until her head rested on his shoulder. Traffic surged forward. He thought about the note in his phone titled Ways to Keep Her World Intact and realized the list had already been replaced by this moment, 2 lives in quiet contact, racing through neon toward whatever version of equilibrium they could forge. Across the median, a delivery truck wearing the Aurora crescent arrow whistled past, oblivious that its owner sat inside an unmarked sedan contemplating the gravity of a single head resting on his shoulder. And somewhere far beyond the Hudson, in dark prairies humming with night insects, data loggers blinked awake, recording the chorus of life that had pulled him off his axis and, paradoxically, set him steady for the first time in years. It began with a scheduled quiet Saturday, sunrise coffee in Thayer's apartment, a quick subway ride to the Bronx River annex of the New York Bat Rescue Alliance, and an afternoon of tagging juvenile hoary bats before their spring migration. The public relations team had explicit instructions: no press, no "look at our benevolent CEO" tweets, no glossy blog posts. Thayer wanted one day where the only lenses pointed his way belonged to thermal cameras tracking wing beats. For the first hour everything cooperated. Thayer wore cargo jeans and a thrift store Columbia jacket borrowed from Saraphina's closet. She teased him that he looked like a grad student whose fellowship check had bounced. In the rehab greenhouse they worked shoulder to shoulder, Saraphina measuring forearm lengths while Thayer logged data. The bats chattered like tiny castanets each time she brushed a wing membrane with her thumb. Watching her find the soft rhythm that calmed them made him wish someone had catalogued his nervous system with that tenderness. The breach came at 11:17 a.m., exactly 90 seconds after a volunteer flung open a side door to wheel in fresh trays of mealworms. Sunlight shot through the opening, and with it the rapid-fire strobe of a high-resolution camera. One photographer, maybe two, crouched behind the mulberry bushes bordering the service driveway. Thayer reacted first, sliding between Saraphina and the door, but the shutter had already captured a tableau more intimate than any gossip columnist could stage: a billionaire CEO in rumpled denim bending close to a young scientist whose gloved hand was nestled in his, a fragile bat hanging upside down between them like a living pendant. Security reached the intruders in under 30 seconds, yet the damage was cellular, images replicating themselves across social platforms before Thayer even pocketed his phone. By the time he led Saraphina outside, sirens of arriving police cars mingled with a deeper, psychic alarm, the familiar sensation of his life's perimeter collapsing. He bundled her into a waiting rideshare, his own driver would follow. The car smelled of vanilla air freshener and yesterday's fries, jarringly normal. Saraphina stared at her phone, notifications danced like static. A coworker had already texted, "You're trending." She turned the screen toward Thayer, a headline from an entertainment site notorious for clickbait. Mystery Blonde Tames Ice King, Carlisle, Bat Cave Love Nest exclusive. Below, the first photo, her laughing at something he'd whispered, mouth half open in delight. The second, his palm resting on her lower back, guiding her away from sunlight that could burn the nocturnal patient in her hands. To anyone outside the context, the gesture looked unmistakably possessive. Thayer's stomach plunged, but worse was the silence beside him. Saraphina's freckles had drained of color. She pulled at the seatbelt latch as if concocting an escape plan mid-traffic. "Talk to me," he said, voice low, steady. I don't speak this language," she managed. The one that turned seconds into billboards. He wanted to promise protection, an invisibility cloak, anything, but the car was already passing digital billboards that might soon host her face. "Let's get you home first," he said, redirecting the driver to her apartment in Washington Heights. "We'll figure strategy after you've had 5 minutes to breathe." But Aurora's crisis response protocol allowed no breathing room. By the time Saraphina climbed the 5 flights to her walk-up, Thayer's watch vibrated with an emergency board meeting request. A red banner flashed across the embedded OLED, "Market sensitive, attend immediately." He set his palm against her doorframe. "Give me 2 hours," he pleaded. "No decisions until then. Thayer, your empire is hemorrhaging PR points. Go." She attempted a smile, it cracked at the edges. He kissed her forehead, a reflexive benediction, and bounded downstairs, already drafting talking points in his head. Personal time. Philanthropic context. Zero corporate resources misused. He called Keiko and spooled instructions: freeze outgoing statements, monitor shareholder chat rooms, prepare data on past CEO philanthropic outings. Inside the boardroom, Marietta Quinlan had marshaled the directors into two camps, those worried about brand dilution and those salivating over increased media reach. A massive OLED displayed a live feed of Aurora's stock ticker, share price seesawing like a seismograph. Thayer strode to the head of the table before anyone could interpret his hesitation as weakness. He opened with the logistical truth: I was at a conservation facility fulfilling our environmental impact commitments, not a lie, merely an undersell. Then he injected the personal: I was accompanied by Dr. Saraphina Waverly, an independent zoologist whose research Aurora currently funds. She and the Alliance conduct essential fieldwork mitigating the decline of North American bat populations. He paused, scanning faces for signs of predatory delight. I stand by my support, professionally and personally. A director from London, all silver cuff links and carnivore grin, leaned forward. And personally involves holding hands on company time. The phrase was bait. Thayer ignored it. Saraphina's presence will continue to be separate from corporate decision-making. She has no stake in Aurora logistics or governance. He signaled Marietta. She clicked a remote. The screen switched from stock graphs to a slide titled Long-Term Value in Authentic Sustainability. The next 8 minutes were a tour de force: shipping lanes optimized for reduced echolocation interference, bat-friendly light spectra retrofit onto port cranes, ESG ratings projected to rise 2 basis points. When the presentation ended, silence hung thick as bunker fuel. Finally, the London director grunted. If you can turn your little romance into a tax credit, Carlyle, be my guest. Just keep it out of the tabloids. Thayer bit back a retort. He'd already made up his mind. We'll issue a statement tonight. Transparent, minimal. No angled shots. Meeting adjourned. Outside the glass walls, Keiko waited, flanked by 2 communications officers. Share price rebounded 3% during the slide on ESG, she reported. But gossip blogs are speculating she's your secret fiancé. He exhaled. The truth was rapidly catching up to the speculation, even if he hadn't planned the reveal like this. Set a press conference for 6, he said, surprising himself. I'll answer directly. Location: main lobby. Company backdrop: no red carpet. Keiko's brows rose a millimeter. She'd seen him navigate hostile mergers with colder calculation, but she nodded. And Dr. Waverly? Invite her, but no pressure. I'll handle questions solo if she'd rather stay out. The hours until 6 blurred. Thayer rewrote statements, rejected talking points, changed into a charcoal suit, then discarded the tie. At 5:42 he texted Saraphina, speaking to press at 6. I won't mention private details without you. 0 expectations, but you're welcome. 3 dots blinked, then nothing. He slipped the phone into his jacket and descended to the lobby. Camera tripods crowded the marble floor. Reporters murmured like bees preparing to sting. He stepped to the podium. Good evening. Today photos circulated implying impropriety between myself and Dr. Saraphina Waverly. Allow me to clarify, there is none. Dr. Waverly is an accomplished field biologist whose work aligns with Aurora Logistics' commitment to biodiversity preservation. Our relationship, however, extends beyond professional respect. Flashes erupted. He continued, I have been, frankly, humbled by her knowledge, integrity, and the way she challenges our company to exceed compliance and pursue stewardship. I intend to honor that influence by expanding our nocturnal wildlife safe passage initiative across all North American facilities. A reporter shouted, Are you dating her, Mr. Carlyle? He met the room's hunger with steady composure. Yes. I care for her deeply. And should that relationship evolve further, you'll hear it from me, not tabloids. More questions volleyed, about insider influence, about wedding rumors. Thayer answered each with the calm precision of a man accustomed to volatile exchanges, until a ripple passed through the crowd, heads turned, lenses swiveled. Saraphina had entered from the side corridor, wearing jeans, scuffed boots, and a navy blazer borrowed from Thayer's closet. She carried the planter of switchgrass like a shield. Reporters surged forward. Thayer locked eyes with her, silently offering an escape route. She shook her head minutely and approached the podium. He stepped back one pace. She adjusted the microphone down an inch. "I didn't plan to speak," she began, voice carrying a tremor the room misread as stage fright but Thayer recognized as tempering steel. "But since photos of me handling a rescue bat have been used to suggest scandal, let me redirect your attention to the bat." She opened a folder and unfurled a high-resolution image, a sonar scan showing port machinery noise overlapping with key bat call frequencies. "This is what matters. Habitat disruption. Light pollution. Shipping lane acoustics. Aurora has pledged resources to mitigate those factors. If my presence accelerates that process, I'll stand here as long as it takes." The reporters fell momentarily silent, scandal overshadowed by a pie chart of wing fracture incidents. Saraphina continued, outlining how urban bat populations curbed mosquito-borne illnesses, how preserving them intersected with public health. Her voice steadied, gained altitude. By the time she concluded with a simple, "questions," the room's energy had flipped, half the journalists now squinted at the data, genuinely curious. Thayer stepped beside her, not touching but close enough she could sense his warmth. A financial correspondent raised a hand. "So, are you two engaged?" Saraphina inhaled. Thayer waited, no scripted answer, no pressure. She glanced at him, an entire conversation passing in a heartbeat, then faced the microphone. "We're exploring something rare," she said. "If it leads to marriage, that will be a collaboration like any other, built on research, patience, and mutual respect. In the meantime, we have bats to save." Laughter rippled, softer now, mixed with applause from some unexpected corner where an intern clapped before his editor elbowed him. Thayer leaned into the mic. "For the record, I'm in favor of that collaboration, and I'm a patient man." Flashes erupted again, but this time the moment belonged to them, not the tabloids. He thanked the press, guided Saraphina off stage, and into a service corridor that smelled of fresh paint and floor wax. Only then did he let the tension break, hands braced against the wall on either side of her shoulders. "You were extraordinary," he whispered. Her smile came slow, aching, triumphant. "I was terrified." "That's courage." She lifted the planter between them. "Think this guy survived the spotlight?" He chuckled, pushing a frond aside to capture her mouth in a kiss, soft, grounding, an unwritten headline they alone would archive. Somewhere distant, the stock ticker pinged updates, social feeds recalibrated, but in the hush of a service hallway they set the story straight: two people, one fragile ecosystem, and the reckless, precise hope that love, like bats navigating night air, could chart a path by echoes no algorithm had yet learned to measure. When the echo of reporters' questions finally died, Saraphina asked for time and open sky. Thayer answered by abandoning Manhattan 2 days later, steering his hybrid Range Rover north through blooming apple country until highways shrank to two-lane roads ribboning toward Lake Ontario. They left before dawn to outrun paparazzi, but also, in truth, to outrun the centrifugal pull of boardrooms and lecture halls. In the cargo bay lay only her duffel, the switchgrass planter, and a cooler packed with groceries he had insisted on buying himself: green market vegetables, local trout, a reckless surplus of dark chocolate. By mid-afternoon the lake house emerged, cedar-clad and low-slung among white pines like a structure grown, not built. A single pier pointed into water so clear it reflected the sky twice, once on its surface, once in the pale stones beneath. No neighboring roofs, no cell signal, just wind across weathered shingles and the faint hiss of distant surf. Saraphina stepped from the car and inhaled resinous air. "No helicopters," she teased, but the relief in her voice softened the joke. "Just loons," Thayer promised. "They don't sell photos." Inside, wide plank floors creaked reassuringly. Windows had no curtains, only timber frames that admitted the lake as permanent artwork. A single painting, a charcoal study of migrant snow buntings in the teeth of a blizzard, hung above the hearth. She set her bag beside the sofa, touched the frame of the drawing, and sensed a story folded inside the silence. They slipped quickly into a rhythm foreign to Thayer's lifetime of alarms. Sunrise found him on the screened porch grinding coffee while she threaded binocular straps through belt loops for morning bird counts. Afternoons they kayaked along reed beds, paddles dipping without speech. Nights, with only a cast-iron stove for light, she braided his hair, longer than corporate photos suggested, and taught him how to differentiate cricket trills by counting pulse intervals. The quiet did not feel empty, it felt calibrated, like the precise distance between stars that keeps galaxies from tearing themselves apart. On the third evening thunderheads stacked over the horizon. They hauled kayaks ashore and raced uncertain rain back to the house. When the storm finally broke, needles of water slashed the deck, power flickered, surrendered, and left them in a blackout broken only by lightning mapping the lake in negative. Thayer fetched lanterns from a storage bench, but when he set one on the hearth his hand lingered on the bunting sketch. "My mother drew that," he said, voice barely above the rain's drum. "She loved birds that migrate against odds. Said they were proof movement could be salvation." Saraphina rested beside him on the rug, knees brushing. "You've never mentioned her." "She died when I was 19. Lightning flashed, shadows shivered across his jaw. "Alcohol, mostly. But it was her stillness that killed her, I think. She wanted to study art in Montreal, kept delaying until someday turned to never. By then the bottle felt more reachable than the road." Seraphina's fingers found the ridge of scar beneath his ribs, the motorcycle wreck he had confessed in the city greenhouse. "You kept moving so you wouldn't calcify." He gave a ragged laugh. "I sprinted so grief couldn't tag me. It worked until it didn't." He traced the edge of the drawing. "I bought and buried myself in Aurora to prove I could pilot something too colossal to crash. But colossal things crash in slow motion. Sometimes you don't notice until the dust covers everything." Wind-bent pines against the eaves. She waited, offering silence as scaffold. When he spoke again his voice carried none of the polished certainty reporters chased. "I need you to know the board can't use you as leverage. I video-conferenced them this morning. Transferred 8% of my voting shares into a trust bound to conservation funding. They can't claw it back without a unanimous vote that includes mine." He inhaled, preparing for pushback. Instead she asked, "And if the relationship ends?" "The trust remains." Rain hammered harder, as if to notarize the vow. Saraphina searched his face for the reflex of conquest she had seen in other powerful men. It wasn't there. "I don't measure commitment in press conferences," she said softly. "I measure it in who washes the sampling jars after fieldwork, who bothers to learn the names of noxious moths." "Then let me start with dishes," he replied, almost shy. They cooked by lantern, trout seared in browned butter, sweet corn, bread toasted in the stove's mouth. Afterward Thayer elbowed her away from the sink and scrubbed every pan while she catalogued the day's bird sightings in her field journal. When water finally ran clear, she closed the notebook. "We still have one imbalance, Thayer. Novelty." She folded her legs beneath her. "New love is a spike of dopamine, bright, promising, unreliable. Exhilarating for you, flattering for me. What happens when something shinier swings past?" He dried his hands, leaned against the counter. "You want proof I won't chase diversion? I can't time-stamp the future. But I can demonstrate pattern change." "Pattern change?" He opened a cabinet where an old corkboard hung inside the door, dotted with faded Polaroids of young Thayer on cargo docks, blueprint sketches, a ridiculous magazine cutout that proclaimed fortunes 40 under 40. He pinned a fresh square of paper at the center. On it he wrote, "First day not running." Underneath, today's date. "I haven't stopped sprinting since freshman year." He set the pen down. "Help me learn sustainable speed." She stared at the slip, simple as any data label but heavier than stock shares. Finally she tore a narrow strip from her journal, wrote "First day letting someone in," and pinned it beside his. Accountability goes both ways. Outside, thunder rolled eastward, rain softened to whisper. They carried quilts to the porch, listening to drips from eaves. A loon called, low and ancient, across dark water. "Not what your investors pictured for a Saturday night," she murmured, head against his shoulder. "My investors can adapt." He twined his fingers through hers. "So can I." In the days that followed, adaptation became practice. He ignored 90% of incoming emails. The world failed to end. She surrendered the need to annotate every observation, letting certain mysteries remain unnamed. They argued once, over whether Aurora's green corridor could realistically offset maritime sulfur emissions, but the debate sharpened respect instead of loosening affection. On the sixth dawn she found him on the pier, shoes and phone discarded, trousers rolled to his calves. He was simply watching sunrise, nothing in his hands to monetize the moment. She stepped beside him, and they built a first shared ritual, 20 breaths of silent attention before speech. That evening, as they loaded the car for their return to Manhattan, Saraphina tucked the switchgrass planter into the back seat and placed the stormlit bunting sketch on her lap for safekeeping. Thayer started the engine but kept the parking brake engaged. "I want to ask you something," he said, eyes on the gravel drive instead of her. "Not the question the tabloids want. A preliminary question." "I'm listening." "Give me time, however long it takes, to prove that this isn't novelty. I'm not asking you to move in, or promise marriage on a deadline. I'm asking for the chance to show you consistency in mundane increments." She ran a thumb along the sketch's wooden frame. The birds inside looked as though they flew by sheer belief through impossible weather. "Consistency in mundane increments," she repeated, tasting the phrase. "Terms accepted." He released the brake, tires crunched forward. The lake receded behind pines, but the quiet they had harvested there traveled with them like extra oxygen in the cabin air. Ahead waited committees, grant revisions, and a media cycle hungry for their next misstep. Yet as the highway widened, Seraphina glanced sideways and found Thayer smiling, not the corporate half-smile calibrated for shareholder comfort, but an unguarded flash of contentment. He caught her look, shrugged slightly, and explained without words, 20 breaths at sunrise, sustainable speed. She let her hand rest on the console, palm up. He placed his over it, gentle pressure, no claim. Kilometer by kilometer the city's glow swelled on the horizon, but the grip between their hands did not alter with the brightness. A month passed, not in cinematic leaps but in the incremental heartbeat of ordinary days, exactly as Seraphina had demanded. Weekday morning she left her walk-up at 6 to catch the one train to Columbia's Zoology Annex. On the ride she often found Thayer's latest, consistency report, waiting in her inbox, nothing dramatic, just a single photo documenting something mundanely human, a bowl he had hand-washed and left to dry, a half-written sticky note reminding himself to stretch every hour, the screen of his phone showing Do Not Disturb enabled. She answered with equally small calibrations, an audio clip of Prairie Dawn she used to center her classes, a snapshot of her office cactus finally sprouting an improbable bud. They didn't always respond in real time, and that was part of the proof, each trusted the other's silence. Their public lives, however, refused stillness. Aurora's shareholders demanded quarterly miracles, donors wanted Saraphina on podcasts, and gossip columns kept searching for cracks in the fairy tale. Every invitation to appear on morning TV or glossy magazine covers went politely unanswered. Instead, they let the media chase them through absence, while they chased something slower, weight-bearing, real. In mid-May a certified envelope appeared on Seraphina's campus mailbox, thick, cream-colored, her name handwritten in Thayer's recognizably angular script. She opened it in the stairwell. Inside lay a notarized deed and an explanatory letter headed with Aurora's crescent arrow but written in the first person. I have restructured 41% of my personal holdings into the Waverly Endowment for Predictive Ecology, an autonomous foundation with its own governing board, a sunset clause that binds funds to field research in perpetuity, and no means for me to retract so much as a penny without unanimous scientific oversight. In numbers too dry for the tabloids, that's $3.8 billion locked away from quarterly profit reports and placed at the mercy of people who tag bats at midnight. I'm the same man you met, for better or worse, but my ratios are changing. I wanted you to see the ledger before anyone else. No request, no pressure, just a report. She folded the letter carefully and carried it to class, numb with something larger than gratitude, smaller than disbelief. During her afternoon lecture on pheromone signaling she lost her train of thought only once, imagining the moment a junior researcher 10 years from now would open a Waverly Endowment grant email and realize field dreams had quietly become feasible. That evening she called Thayer. "Are you aware," she began, "that you just made me a line item in the SEC archives?" His chuckle was low with relief. "I was hoping for a thank you, but regulatory scolding is on brand." "Thank you," she conceded, then added, "and what possessed you to name it after me?" "Because there are 50 Aurora-branded initiatives already. I needed the ledger to remind me who taught me to decelerate." She rubbed her forehead, still dizzy. "You realize my peers will suspect I demanded this." "They'll suspect you did something impossible," he corrected. "Which, last I checked, is your standard field protocol." 2 weeks later he invited her to the greenhouse atop Aurora's headquarters, just the two of them, dusk on a Friday, when most staff had vanished for Memorial Day escapes. She arrived in jeans and a chambray shirt still dusted with chalk from grading lab finals. The elevator doors parted onto a corridor perfumed with soil and leaf vapor, amber grow lights cast long shadows of milkweed across the concrete floor. Thayer waited by a trellis of white wisteria, hands clasped behind his back like a nervous docent. On a small teak table rested 2 envelopes and a Yucatan hammock's worth of green vines curling from planters. He gestured for her to join him beneath the bloom-laden branches. "Tonight isn't about declarations," he said, though his pulse raced visibly in the hollow of his throat. "It's about options. You once told me agency mattered more than spectacle." I listened. He pointed to the first envelope, heavy, slate-gray vellum sealed with a discreet wax crescent. "This is a marriage agreement. Not a traditional prenup. You'll find no compensation clauses, no morality riders, no percentages. It states that if at any point you decide the partnership constrains your science, the partnership dissolves and our respective assets revert untouched. I keep only the memories, you keep every orbital path you helped alter." Saraphina raised an eyebrow. "You drafted a contract that gives me veto power over your own empire?" "I drafted the only document that felt honest." He swallowed. "If legalism must exist, let it favor the one whose life will be more disrupted." She brushed the wax with her thumb but didn't break it. He indicated the second envelope, cobalt blue, airmail stripes along the edges. "A ticket to Panama," he said. "Cargo vessel Helios Meridian departs Galveston in 10 days with a berth converted to a field lab. The route threads your beloved Darien Gap research stations. No press, no corporate entourage, just you, your graduate team, and logistics support operating under your command. Duration, 4 months. Her breath caught. She had dreamed of Central American canopy transects since undergrad, a biome stitched with unknown moth species and bats that navigated more densely than anywhere on Earth. Funding had always collapsed under the weight of import permits and satellite bandwidth. "I want you to choose," Thayer continued. "You can sign the agreement tonight, or board that ship and forget me until the last data set is uploaded. Or do both, in whichever order makes you trust the outcome." He stepped back, palms open, an offering, not a proposition. Rain began ticking softly against the greenhouse glass. Outside, Manhattan's skyline glimmered like circuitry, inside, only the hush of photosynthetic machinery answered. Seraphina closed her eyes, feeling the strange equilibrium of the moment, one envelope heavy with potentially lifelong intimacy, the other light with the promise of distance and discovery. She thought of her prairie notebooks, her students who believed academia and attachment were mutually exclusive, her mother who once warned that big personalities could eclipse small scientific fires. She reached first for the blue envelope, weighing it like a specimen jar. 4 months at sea, she murmured. Storms, quarantine protocols, satellite lags. And canopy mist nets at dawn, he reminded gently. New species codes singing behind your recorder. She smiled, tracing the airmail stripe. Then she set the ticket back on the table, still untouched, and pressed her forefinger against the edge of the wax seal on the slate envelope, but did not break it either. Instead she looked up, eyes fierce with their own clarity. Love is not a binary, Thayer Carlyle. It's a migration route with multiple stopovers, some of them surprise detours. I choose the entire map. She grasped both envelopes simultaneously, one in each hand. I'll sign the agreement and take the voyage. You will not follow. You'll send supply drops and occasional snail mail letters, no broadband, no algorithmic pings. When the Helios meridian returns, we'll review the data and the marriage in the same week. If both hold statistical significance, we proceed to publication, joint authorship. A grin exploded across his face, half shock, half awe. Peer-reviewed matrimony. With a robust methodology section, she confirmed, heartbeat skittering with exhilaration and terror. If that intimidates you, withdraw the offer now. Intimidate me? He exhaled a laugh like a man leaning over the edge of something beautiful and very high. Saraphina, you just gave me the expedition proposal of a lifetime. Lightning flickered beyond the fiberglass roof, illuminating the wisteria like suspended ghosts. He pulled a Mont Blanc pen from his jacket and clicked it open, but she stopped him with a gesture. Ink smears and humidity, she said, producing a mechanical pencil from her back pocket, the same field pencil he'd once found holding her hair atop the Halcyon Hotel. She cracked the seal, flipped the contract to the signature page, and wrote her name in graphite steady as a seismograph during calm. Then she slid the document toward him. My turn, he murmured. Pencil in hand, he signed beneath her scrawl, the sound of graphite on vellum almost lost beneath the rain. When he finished, she tucked the agreement back into its envelope and slid it into the pocket of his suit. Guard that, she said. I'll need the original for the appendix. And the ticket, he asked. She lifted it, kissed the corner, and tucked it into her shirt pocket. Boarding pass and wedding invitation in one. He drew her into the scent of wisteria and damp soil, resting his forehead against hers. I'll miss you like air. Then breathe better, she whispered, kissing him once, lingering, a kiss not of ownership but of overlapping trajectories. I'll send coordinates. Later, as they left the greenhouse, Thayer flicked off the grow lights. Darkness swallowed the plants, but the phosphorescent stems of genetically tagged milkweed glowed faintly, mapping veins of life through shadow. Saraphina watched, memorizing the paths. Somewhere in that gentle afterglow their future curved, dual and unscripted, toward whatever Chapter 8 would measure in poems, reports, or simply the pulse of two signatures drying side by side in the humid Manhattan night. The Helios meridian nosed through the Panama Canal at first light, its bow knifing a low gray mist as gulls wheeled overhead and the lock gates boomed shut behind. 4 months at sea had salted Seraphina's skin and bleached the tips of her hair the color of antique bone. She leaned on the rail in a frayed field shirt, a hard-shelled sample case clutched to her chest. Inside lay the voyage's treasure, vials of frozen tissue, terabytes of sonar recordings, and a single specimen tube no longer than her thumb holding a cinnamon-winged juvenile whose call fell in a frequency window no one had recorded in the Darien Gap. If the genetics held up, she would soon introduce the world to Chiroptera carlisleyi. Before that, she meant to show it to the man whose faith had paid for her patience. Customs at Newark crawled, but Thayer had honored her rule of no GPS trackers. His one indulgence hovered outside the arrival gate, a red-tailed courier drone from Aurora's logistics lab. After scanning her iris it lowered a velvet pouch into her palm and veered off into Jersey sky. A midnight blue sapphire, flecked with ochre fossils, lay inside, its recycled titanium band etched with the latitude of the very cove where the bat had been netted. Beneath the ring a scrap of handmade paper read in his unmistakable hand, ETA 1700 hours. The atrium is noisy, but the acoustics favor declarations. T. She tucked the pouch into her jacket, splashed water on her face in a port restroom, and traded sea-crusted boots for clean ones pulled from her duffel. There was no time for the Washington Heights shower she craved, the city's afternoon traffic already pulsed like a living reef. She sped downtown in a yellow cab that smelled of pine cleaner and cardamom coffee, the Manhattan skyline rising through the windshield with every block. Aurora's lobby was a half-lit temple of glass when she slipped through the staff entrance 10 minutes before the press conference. Thayer paced behind the projection scrim, dark suit immaculate, movement anything but composed. 3 months of crisis calls, shareholder skirmishes, and midnight code reviews had sharpened the angles of his face, only the glint in his eyes softened when he saw her. He started forward, stopped himself, and simply opened both hands, palms up, an invitation and a question. She set her sample case on a side table, laced her fingers with his for one silent heartbeat, then nodded toward the wings of the stage. They parted without speaking, the moment for data, then for something wilder, was ticking down. Cameras blinked awake. Reporters adjusted earpieces while Aurora's crescent logo rotated in holographic slow motion above the dais. Thayer led with carbon margin charts and 3 months of noise-dampened shipping metrics. He talked megatons, cost curves, Scandinavian green bonds. When the analyst's eyes began to glaze, he shifted. Impact is measured in megatons, he said, voice dropping, but also in milligrams. I'd like you to meet the milligram expert. The double doors opened. Saraphina strode out in cargo pants and a navy field jacket embroidered with the Waverly Endowment's owl wing sigil. Her satchel bumped her hip, salt wind had yet to relinquish its claim on her braid. Gasps rippled, this was no red carpet entrance but a scientist walking straight off a canopy rig. She placed a compact microscope on the podium, angled its camera toward the main screen, and unscrewed her specimen tube. 14 weeks ago, she began, the deck wind still roughening her voice, we netted a juvenile bat south of Playa Muerto. His call fell between the upper range of Lophostoma and the lower band of Micronycteris, a frequency window Aurora's quieter tugs finally made recordable. A waveform blossomed across the screen, followed by a magnified still of translucent wings and a speckled muzzle. Preliminary sequencing indicates a divergent lineage. Pending peer review, she swept the room with a dare me smile, we may have a new species. Provisional name Chiroptera carlislii. The room inhaled. Thayer swallowed hard, twice, before remembering to breathe. She raised a hand for quiet. The Waverly Endowment will fund an independent panel to verify the lineage, with no Aurora branding on the masthead. Her other hand dipped into her pocket, velvet flashed under the lights. And because comprehensive disclosure includes personal variables, I am also announcing that I have accepted Mr. Carlyle's hypothesis that our partnership can survive peer review. She slipped the sapphire onto her own finger, an inversion of custom deliberate as any field protocol. Laughter broke from half the press corps, the rest hammered shutters. Thayer forced his feet to move. He crossed to her side but did not kiss her, only lifted their joined hands so every lens could frame the minerals, the fossils, the living skin between. This ring, he said, pitching his voice for the front row only, contains Cambrian shells fused inside sapphire. Love, like geology, is slow and immense and sometimes preserves miracles. A reporter called, wedding date. Saraphina angled the microphone. After the migration season. Our guest list includes 1,200,000 bats. We won't compete with their flight paths. The atrium shook with applause and flash fire. They escaped through a maintenance corridor that smelled of latex paint and damp cardboard, laughing like fugitives. In his 7th-floor lab office she slotted each specimen vial into refrigeration while Thayer countersigned digital releases for the endowment's first grants. When the last tube clicked home she leaned against the fridge, ring catching the sterile light. He asked, "You calibrated," echoing her own phrase from months before. She nodded. Variables align, error bars acceptable. Her smile tugged him forward. Ready for the long-term study, he murmured. Consistency, novelty, repeatability, she recited, then hooked a finger through his belt loop. But let's write the discussion section together. Outside, pundits parsed stock ticks and trended hashtags, skylines flickered into evening circuits. Inside, two people who once measured victory in opposite currencies drafted a joint ledger of smaller truths, 20 breaths at sunrise, dishes washed while field notes dried, letters that smelled of salt and jet fuel, the silent corridor between megatons and milligrams where a new species might find room to evolve. 24 hours later they boarded a red-eye to Labrador, thermal parkas stuffed under the seats and a bottle of cheap champagne wedged between sample cases. Somewhere over the Gulf of St. Lawrence the magnetosphere cracked into sheets of green fire, an aurora dancing outside the cabin windows like the company's sigil raised to the power of myth. Saraphina pressed her forehead to the plexiglass, eyes wide. Thayer watched the lights ripple in her pupils and understood that the headline he'd sworn to rewrite had already morphed into something rarer, a story measured not in quarterly dividends but in wing beats, wavelengths, and the shockingly quiet hum of sustainable speed, still accelerating toward whatever constellations love and science would chart next.